How useful are sources B and C for an inquiry into why the USA escalated its involvement in Vietnam? Explain your answer using sources B and C and your knowledge of the historical context. 8 marks. Here's the mark scheme for this question, which you can find out about in more detail in the overview video. But we do know that all 8 marks here are awarded for AO3, and that's your analysis and evaluation of source utility. All that means really is you making a judgment on how useful this source is to the inquiry that you've been given in the question. In order to make that judgment, you might focus on one of these things, so how accurate it might be, how reliable you think it is, any limitations, so things that it doesn't include or isn't really that helpful for, knowledge of the author which is given to you above the source, or valuable information offered by the source. If you can focus on maybe one or two of these to decide how useful the source is for your inquiry, it's a really easy way to score highly in AO3. That means that rather than just making an assertion, so saying this source is useful, you need to reason, you need to use one of these factors above to decide how useful the source is. You'll also be thinking about the content, so what the source actually says. You'll be thinking about the context, so what you know about when it was written or what it's written about. And provenance, so who wrote it, when did they write it, why did they write it, and so on. So just try and keep those things in mind. You don't have to talk about everything, but just try and keep them in mind to make sure that your answer is really nicely focused on utility. It's also important to remember that the question isn't asking you to compare source B and source C. In fact, you could actually talk about them separately. You've got to think about why B is useful and why C is useful, not if one is more useful than the other. Here are the bands for this question. Now you can see in order to score in the highest band, you need to show developed reasoning. So maybe you've used one of the factors that we listed above to make a judgment on how useful the source is and really clearly explain your thinking. You've also considered the provenance, so where the source came from, and how that might impact how useful the source is. You could also draw in some contextual knowledge, so stuff that you already know about the topic, to help you to interpret the source and make that judgment. Essentially, this question is all about stating how useful you think the source is, using the information given to you in the source and before it, and the information that you already have about the topic, to explain why you made that judgment. Showing that you can do this well is how you can score in the highest band. As long as the points you make here are related to the focus of the question and factually correct, the examiner should accept them. But let's take a look at an example for source B. You can see that the mark scheme is divided into 3 subheadings. So let's first look at the utility of the content of the source. So what's it actually saying? You might say that it argues that North Vietnam was an aggressor. Maybe see if you can explain that in a bit more detail and why that is so important. Secondly, the utility of the source's provenance, so where it comes from, who wrote it, and the purpose, so what it's trying to do. You might say that as president, Johnson needed to defend his choices and justify them. The war had already been costly in terms of troops and finances, so he needed some popular support at this stage. Finally, the utility of the source in relation to its historical context. Now, this is your opportunity to bring in the stuff that you already know and impress the examiner with your knowledge. You could then talk about Eisenhower's domino theory and how it continued to inspire Cold War politics during Johnson's presidency. Now, if you can link all 3 of those subheadings together, that's a brilliant developed point, which shows how analytically you've approached the question and how carefully you've thought about the focus. Take a look at the rest of the points here, though, to see if there's anything you could have added to your answer, and do the same for source C in a second.